I'm gonna mute everybody. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. It's great to have you here. Welcome, welcome. We're going to keep everyone on mute for the beginning of this time, and there will be options to unmute for conversation in just a little bit. Give everyone just one more minute to show up. That's still not working. Okay, welcome everyone. It is so wonderful to be able to gather here this morning. I am Ilana Garber. I'm the Director of Global Rabbinic Development for the Rabbinical Assembly, and I'm here to help. If there are any technical issues or any other questions, I'll be moderating the chat, so please be in touch if I can help with anything. And also, I'm going to put into the chat a whole bunch of links throughout the morning, everything from the source sheet to some more information about Pesach. Believe it or not, I'm even going to put in some information about Shavuot, because, you know, as they say, it's only about 7 weeks away or so. And also other information about how to access us and be in touch and all of that. So it's great to be able to have you here. Again, I'm going to ask for everyone to stay on mute until down the road a little bit. And it's my pleasure to welcome our teacher for this morning, Rabbi Morty Schwartz, who is the director of the Beit Midrash at JTS. He's also the head of the Nishma summer program. He's a professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. He's taught at Rutgers, at State University of New Jersey, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Hebrew Union College, and his new book, Rewriting the Talmud, on the effect of tradition from the land of Israel on the composition of the Babylonian Talmud, was released in the summer of 2019. And so it is a pleasure to be able to welcome Rabbi Schwartz.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Garber. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to explain what we're going to do here and the reason that we're going to do this, and then I'm going to hop right in. So this is a Siyum B'chorim. There is a strong custom that developed relatively early on in the Middle Ages for firstborn to fast on the day before Passover. This year, the day before Passover is Saturday, is Shabbat, and so we can't fast. It's forbidden to fast on Shabbat, so we're doing this on Thursday. There is also a prohibition that developed in the Middle Ages on fasting in Nisan. These are two contradictory things. The idea that on the one hand, firstborn need to fast in commemoration of the final plague, the death of the firstborn. On the other hand, the prohibition on fasting in Nisan. Oh, here's my Bechor who just came in. Hi, Isaac. The prohibition on fasting on Nisan. So what developed in order to be able to do both of these things, to commemorate the death of the firstborn and the salvation of firstborn Israelites, on the one hand, and also to uphold the prohibition on fasting in Nisan, is that there would be a siyum, the completion, the joyful completion of a tractate of the Talmud, usually, which would then allow a seudat mitzvah. Normally, we would engage in that seudat mitzvah, in that celebratory meal together. but because of the pandemic, we're doing this virtually. But everyone should immediately eat after I actually do the ritual Siyum in celebration of the completion of the tractate. And then once you have broken your fast, you're going to be able to eat the remainder of the day. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the tractate that I studied, that I've been studying for the past, sort of month and a half. And I'll talk a little bit about it, and then we'll jump in. I'll read the first Mishnah. I'll read a section from the middle. I studied the Babylonian Talmud, which is what our Talmud. And then I'll go to the last Mishnah, and then I'll finish with the final passage in the Gemara, the final passage in the Babylonian Talmud's treatment of that Mishnah. And then after that, I'll do the ritual completion of a tractate, which will allow us to then have that celebratory meal. I am to be reciting the Kaddish de Itchadta. The notion being that we are going to constitute a minyan even over the internet. At that time, I'm going to ask everybody to unmute so that we can all join together and create a minyan. Okay, so fine. Here is the tractate that I studied. I studied Avodah Zarah, which literally means foreign worship, right? It is about idolatry primarily, but really what the tractate is about, what really it turns to in the Mishnah, and what it turns to in the Talmud Bavli and the Gemara is in fact the relationships between Jews and non-Jews primarily. And that's expressed in a number of different ways. One is about transacting business with non-Jews, meaning we are not allowed to contribute to idolatry. And the assumption in the Mishnah is that non-Jews are idolatrous. Remember, we're talking about a period of time in which monotheism has not yet taken hold amongst most non-Jewish groups. And so it is prohibited for Jews to contribute to idolatrous practices, to benefit from idolatrous practices financially. And so there is a prohibition on transacting business between Jews and non-Jews prior to these idolatrous festivals. And we'll see that when we jump in and look at the Mishnah. And then there's a variety of other things that are discussed in the tractate, including prohibitions on particular kinds of foods like wine and cheese that are designed to create separation between Jews and idolaters. And then there are a variety of dietary laws that end up being discussed. And a lot of what we would call kashrut, a lot of what we would call the kosher laws today are actually contained in two major sections in tractate Avodah Zarah, one towards the middle and one towards the end. There are a variety of other things that are talked about in terms of like what happens if you find an idol, how can you nullify an idol, can an idol be maintained by Jews as decoration. I have a good friend, for instance, who has a variety of different sorts of Buddhist and Hindu statues above his mantelpiece as decoration. Is that something that Jews can have for decorative purposes? At the point in which it's no longer an idol, when non-Jews no longer believe in those idols, is one allowed to use it? A variety of topics that are discussed. We're not going to have time to discuss all of those other issues. I am going to talk primarily, on the one hand, about the question of non-Jewish festivals. I'm going to talk also about the question of Christianity. Is Christianity an idolatrous religion, considered an idolatrous religion, or is it not considered an idolatrous religion? And then we'll finish with something that's relevant for Pesach. It happens to be the last passage in Avodah Zarah, but it is relevant for Pesach, which is the question of how one goes about koshering, how one goes about making vessels kosher for Passover. So those are the things we're going to talk. We're going to do those all in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So it's going to be a little bit rapid, but don't worry, I am going to stay on after to answer questions if people have them. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Most of you should have gotten the source sheet. A lot of you are already on the source sheet. on the Google Doc, and that's fine, whether you want to follow me on the screen or whether you want to follow me on the Google Doc. So here I'm going to go through this very first Mishnah. לפני עדיהם של גויים 3 ימים אסור לשאת ולתת עמהם. So 3 days before the festivals of non-Jews, it is forbidden to trade with them. I want to make clear, we are talking about idolatrous non-Jews. We are not talking about what we would call b'nei Noach. In other words, those non-Jews who are rejecting of idolatry. But those non-Jews who do engage in idolatry, we are forbidden to trade with them before their festivals. Lahashilan v'lish'ol mehen, either to lend them money before those festivals or to borrow money from them. Lahalvotan ulelavot mehen. Or for that matter, I guess that previous one was about borrowing actual items. This is about money, right? Borrowing money from them or lending money to them. Lefaran v'lifara mehen, either to collect debts from them, or to return debts to them. Rabbi Yehuda says, Nifra'in mehem mipnei shu meitzer lo. Right, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can actually collect debts from them. Why? Because that actually creates a kind of sadness, that creates a kind of distress, and they're not going to go and thank their idolatrous God for sort of the loss of money. And so there's no fear that that's going to inspire idol worship. Amrulo, they said back to him, meaning Rabbi Yehuda's colleagues in his day said back to him, Afal pei shemeitzer hu achshav, even though when you pay a debt, it's immediately distressing because you lose money, sameach hu la'achar zman, he's going to be happy later on. And so after reflection, when the festival actually comes, he's going to thank his God for having been able to pay the debt, and the debt's no longer hanging over his head. And that's the reason they say to him that one cannot collect debts from a non-Jew before the festival, because then the assumption is he's going to go and he's going to worship his foreign god. The Talmud, first of all, I just want to say there's a very long Agadic section that opens up Bavli Avodah Zarah, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. It goes on for 4 pages of sort of notions about divine judgment and how this all works. But all of that is something that I'm not going to focus on. I'm going to skip that large section, and I'm just going to focus on this small passage on this Mishnah. So there's a question that's asked: does the 3 days that we have here mean days 1, 2, and then the festival day as well? Or does it mean days 1, 2, 3, and then the festival day, right? So the idea is terminus ad quo, terminus ad quem. So what happens here is they try and bring a proof from a position of Rabbi Yishmael. They're unable to make that proof. And then what happens is they come and they say the following thing as a comment on Rabbi Yishmael's position. Rabbi Yishmael says it's not only the 3 days before, but also the 3 days after that are significant. In other words, the idea being that he thinks the 3 days prior to the festival and the 3 days after the festival are forbidden in terms of trade with non-Jews. So the Gemara comments, right? Amar Rav Tachlifa bar Avidimi, Amar Shmuel, Yom Rishon, the Divrei Rabbi Yishmael la Masur, right? So he says the following thing. He says Sunday for Rabbi Yishmael is always going to be prohibited, right? So the notion being that if Rabbi Yishmael believes that the 3 days before and the 3 days after are prohibited, then what that means is if you count Sunday as an idolatrous festival, and yes, they are talking about Christianity here. If you count Sunday as an idolatrous festival, then what would happen is that there would never be a day that you could trade with non-Jews for Rabbi Yishmael, because you would have Sunday, the 3 days before, and then the 3 days after, which are the 6 days of the week. In other words, a total of 7 days every single week for Rabbi Yishmael that would be prohibited in terms of trade with non-Jews. So the notion being that were such a thing true, that if in fact we are counting just the 3 days before and the 3 days after, in other words, not inclusive of the festival, then there would never be a moment for Rabbi Yishmael when one could actually trade with non-Jews, which seems ridiculous. So if we were to count Sunday as one of those days, meaning day 1, 2, the 2 days before Sunday, Sunday itself, and 1, 2, the 2 days after Sunday, then we would have the Wednesday and Thursday, excuse me, the Wednesday and Thursday as days that would be permissible for trade with non-Jews. So what I want to say here is that there is a long discussion. I think it's the third Tosafot actually in at the very beginning of the tractate, which in which the medieval authorities, in which the Tosafot in Provence in the 12th and 13th century discuss whether Christianity is in fact Avodah Zarah or not. They admit that for Rabbi Yishmael's position here, Rabbi Yishmael seems to think that it is. They make the argument that in a number of different ways that it's not. The most prominent among them is that they make the claim there's no actual idolatrous sacrifice in their version of the version of Christianity that they know about, and there are a variety of other reasons that they say all trade is permissible to them, and that seems to be the position that Ashkenazi Jews generally follow. That in fact we do not look at Christianity as an idolatrous religion, obviously not Islam as well. However, our Mizrahi colleagues, our Mizrahi co-religionists, do seem to view Christianity as an idolatrous religion. So it's interesting. There remains a kind of split between the different communities, the different Jewish communities writ large, the different Jewish ethnic communities, about whether Christianity is in fact an idolatrous religion or it's not. I think that in the conservative movement, we would obviously want to look at Christians as monotheists and not look at them as idolaters. But it's an interesting thing to note. Okay, so fine. I'm going to skip ahead in the tractate. We're skipping all the way to 65a, where there's a discussion about exactly the notion of whether, when you have an idolater who does not actually do sacrifice, whether one is allowed to give them gifts on their festival. The assumption being that if they don't actually worship idols, even if they're not Jewish, that there's no problem in giving them a gift or a present, because they're not going to go and thank an idolatrous god. It appears from the story that we're about to look at that this non-Jew who's being discussed, his name is Bar Sheshach, is actually not a believer in any religion. He seems to be a free thinker, and that he does not actually believe in any god. Which is actually rather interesting. You might think in the ancient world that that's not a category that exists, but in fact it does. And it seems as though the rabbi involved here, Rava, is going to assume that in fact it's permitted to send him a gift. This story is fascinating because he sends Bar Sheshach a gift on the day of his festival, but when he on the day of the non-Jewish festival, which he apparently isn't celebrating, but when he goes to greet him on that day, goes to visit him on that day, he's engaged in some very risque behavior, let's say it that way, immoral behavior. And you can read the story here if you are interested in the source sheet. But what happens is that he's engaged in that behavior when Rava comes to visit, and he says to Rava, is there anything that you Jews have in the world to come that is better than what I'm experiencing right now in this world? And he says, yes, in the world to come, what we have that's better than whatever you're engaged in right now is in fact the idea of autonomy, of Jewish autonomy, that we're not beholden to any king except the King of Kings. And Bar Sheshach replies, "Well, I'm not beholden to the king as well. I'm like completely independent and free. I'm rich and everything's good with me." And at exactly that moment, as the way these stories work, in fact, a messenger comes from the king and demands that Bar Sheshach go. The assumption being that maybe the king isn't happy with his behavior and he's about to face something unpleasant when he goes and he visits the king. There's a little bit of a coda to the story where it seems as though Bar Sheshach actually is going to be punished for some kind of internal or latent anti-Semitism that he has. But that is the story. From the story, what I wanted to take away here is simply that idea that, in fact, non-Jews who don't worship idols, even if they have no belief system, even if they're totally secular, it seems as though there is a kind of cordial relationship that Jews and non-Jews of that type are supposed to have. In other words, the notion seems to be that a kind of secularism or a kind of atheism, if you want to call that, although I'm being a little bit anachronistic, is in fact better than idol worship. It's kind of like a step in the right direction. Not quite all the way there, but like a step in the right direction. And that's rather interesting. The other thing that I want to note about this story is there are lots and lots and lots of stories about close relationships between Jews and non-Jews, friendships that you have in this tractate, which is kind of surprising, not what you would expect, but it's a distinction between, on the one hand, the laws that the tractate presents, and on the other hand, the reality that the actual cases, the stories and cases that the tractate presents, which is an interesting kind of interplay. Okay, so let us go down now to the last part of the tractate, and I'll go through the last part of the tractate, and then I am going to perform the ritual here. So I'm going to go rather quickly through this last part of the tractate. This is the last Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, and it talks about non-kosher vessels that one purchases from a non-Jew. Halo kleach klei tashmish min hagoy, someone who purchases utensils, meaning primarily cooking utensils, from a non-Jew. Et shedarko lahatbil yatbil, right? Those things which are going to be used with just cold liquids, all one has to do is immerse them in a mikveh, and that's enough to permit them for use. Lahagil yagil, those things which are used with boiling water, one has to actually boil in water to make them permissible. Labain ba'ur, yilabain ba'ur. If they are used directly in exposure to fire, then one has to expose them to fire. Okay, so we can now get two examples. Hashapud va'askala, so a metal spit upon which one cooks meat or roasts meat, and vaha askala, or a grill upon which one grills meat, meaning those things are directly exposed to the fire. Milabnan ba'or, then one has to expose them to fire. And what we discover in the actual Gemara is it makes the claim that the principle that's being discussed here is kebolo kachpolto, that the heat at which something absorbs forbidden flavor is the level at which it then emits forbidden flavor. And in order to get it to emit all of its forbidden flavor, you have to get it that hot in the kind of thing that it was, the kind of heat that it was originally exposed to. That is what we do today in terms of koshering. And all of that, I think, is self-explanatory, or at least as much as I'm going to explain right now. The last part is the part that we're going to focus on here, which is about knives. Knives apparently have a special status, right? Hasakin, with regard to a knife, shafah v'hi Torah, right? So with a knife, you have to polish it, which does involve the removal of kind of like the surface layer of material, the removal of any stains, and then at that point, it's considered to become tahora, to be here, it's ritually clean, but it also means permissible for use by Jews because you've eliminated any of those negative flavors. So the question is, how much polishing are we actually going to talk about? And that actually is the topic of the last part of the very last passage in Avodah Zarah. Hasakin shafah v'hi Torah, right? So this is the quote from the Mishnah that we just read, right? If a knife you have to polish and then it's permissible for use. Amar Rav Ukva Bar Chama. So Rav Ukva Bar Chama says the following thing. V'noatza asara pa'amim b'karka. He says you have to stab it into the ground 10 times, and then that's sufficient. You don't actually have to do, sort of an extensive polishing. Just stabbing it into hard ground 10 times is enough. At that point, it is, in fact, permitted. I just want to say I have seen people, stick knives into flower pots. That's not what this is talking about. This is just talking about sticking it in hard ground 10 times in order to polish the surface. Amar Rav Huna Bre de Rav Yehoshua. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says the following thing. Uvakarka she'ena avuda. And it also has to be ground, which has not been worked, meaning untilled ground, hard ground. Amar Rav Kahana uvasakin yafesh ein bagumot. Rav Kahana says it also has to be a well-maintained knife that is unpitted. Okay. Tanya Nami Hachi. We also have a Braita, right, which is a source that's from the time period of the Mishnah, but didn't make it into the Mishnah, that teaches the same thing. Sakin yafesh ein bagumot noatza asara pa'amim bakarka. Right, a knife which is sort of in a good state, has no pits in it. What you have to do is stab it 10 times into the ground. Amar Rav Huna Bre de Rav Yehoshua lechobo tonein. Right, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says, what we're talking about here is we're going to cut cold things with it, meaning that you're not using it as a cooking utensil, you're using it with food that you've already removed from the fire. Tonin here doesn't mean completely cool. It means under the amount of, under the temperature at which it would cause your hand to retreat. Yad so let it bo, which is about, I guess, 145 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what they claim. That's what contemporary post-game claim, I should say. Kiha de Mar Yehuda Uvati Bar Tuvi, because we have this story. This is in a case, an actual precedental case, and this case is going to conclude the tractate, where you have Mar Yehuda, who's a rabbinic figure, and Bati Bar Tuvi, who's a Jew, but seems to be some kind of a non-observant or or at least perhaps we would say secular, even though that's kind of anachronistic, but in any case, he's not terribly observant. In the case, Havu Yatve Kame de Shavur Malka, they're sitting in front of the Persian emperor Shavur. Aitu Lakamahu Atroga, they bring an etrog, right, a citron out in front of them. Pasak Achal, so the emperor, he cuts it and then he eats. Pasak Vahavle, right? So he cuts it and then he gives it Levati Bartuva, to Bati Bartuva. Hadar Datsa Asara Zimne Ba'ara. Then this non-Jewish emperor, he sticks the knife 10 times in the ground. Pasak Havle Lamar Yehuda, and he gives it to Mar Yehuda, who's the rabbi in the discussion. Amarle Bati Bartuva. When Bati Bartuva sees this, he says to the emperor, Vahahu Gavra Lav Bar Yisraelhu. He says, what am I? I'm not a Jew? He's a better Jew than me? Amarle Mar Kim Li Begave. He says, I know about him that he's very careful about what he eats. He's very careful to observe the dietary laws. Umar Lakim Li Begave. But you, I know that you're not so careful about the dietary laws. So I'm also not being super careful when I give you, when I'm cutting something with a knife. I'm going to go ahead and cut the knife with this sort of knife, which is my own knife, and give it to you because I know you're going to eat it. Him, I know he's not going to eat it unless I stick it 10 times in the ground. So the notion being, I'm explaining to you why I'm doing this. Not that he's like, don't be offended, but he says, I'm explaining to you why I'm doing this. Ikada Amre, there's another version of the same case where what the emperor said to him was, Idkar, remember, ma'avarat ba'orta, what you did with me last night, not meaning what he did with the king, but what the king knows that he did. Either they ate some kind of non-kosher meal together, or he was engaged in some kind of immoral behavior of some other sort. The medieval commentators imagine that they went out and were carousing with prostitutes the previous evening. In any case, the notion being, him I know, like he's fully observant, you I'm not sure about, and so I'm going to go ahead and ignore the dietary laws when it comes to you. which that's how the tractate ends. The interesting thing here for me is about the knife, and the interesting thing for me here is about the fact that we have a non-Jew, a very powerful non-Jew who has two Jews eating with him, one who's observant and one who's not. That's a fascinating kind of circumstance to be talking about. Okay, Hadaran alach Mesechet Avodah Zarah. So now what we're going to do is we are going to stand up for the Hadaran, for the ritual conclusion of the tractate, and I'll recite the Kaddish, the Itcharetza, the Kaddish that actually concludes the Siyum ritual. Okay, Hadaran, please rise. Hadaran alach Avodah Zarah v'hadarach alan da'atan alach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'da'atan dach alan lo nit nashe minach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'lo tit nashe minan la ba'al mahadain v'la ba'al mada'ate. Hadaran alach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'hadarach alan da'atan alach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'da'atach alan lo nit nashe minach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'lo tit nashe minan lo ba'al mahadain v'lo ba'al mada'ate. Hadaran alach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'hadarach alan da'atan alach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'da'atach alan lo nit nashe minach Mesechet Avodah Zarah v'lo tit nashe minan la ba'alma hadain v'la ba'alma da'ate. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu shetehei toratcha u'emunatenu ba'olam hazeh v'tehei imanu le'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abam bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Harev Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu et divrei Toratecha b'finu v'piviyotamcha Beit Yisrael v'niya nachnu kulanu v'tzeiteinu v'tzeitei amacha Beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha l'Toratecha lishma mo'oivai techak meini mitzvotecha ki le'olam hi yehi libi timim b'chukecha lama'an lo evosh le'olam lo eshkach pikudecha kivam chiantani baruch ata Adonai lamdeni chukecha amen amen sela va'ed. Modim anachnu lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu shesamta chokenu miyoshvei Beit Hamidrash margala b'fumaihu de Rabbanan de Yavna ani bria v'chaveri bria ani melachti ba'ir v'hu melachto b'sadeh ani mashkim limlachti v'hu mashkim limlachto kashem shehu eno mitgader b'mlachti kach ani eini mitgader b'mlachto shema tomar ani marbi v'hu mamit shaninu Achad hamarbe v'achad hamit u'bavad sheyikaven libo l'shamayim. Yehi ratzon lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu lefanecha Adonai Elohai v'Elokei avotai kashem she'ezratani l'sayem Mesechet Avodah Zarah kain ta'azreini lahatchil mesechtot u'sfarim acharim l'saymam lelmod u'lelamed lishmor v'lasot u'lekayem et kol divrei Talmud Toratecha ba'ava u'zechut kol hatanhaim v'amorim v'talmidei chachamim ya'amod li u'lezari shelo tamush haTorah mipi zari adolam yitkayim bi behit alechtecha tanche otcha b'shochbecha tishmor alecha v'hakitzota hi tesichecha kivi yirbu yamecha v'yosif lecha shnot chayim orichem bimina bismola osher v'chavod Adonai oz la'amo yitain Adonai yevarech et amo v'shalom. Please unmute at this point. We're going to recite the Kaddish. Gadal v'gadal Rabbi Alma Dibra Guati the Tarata Hayam Maitaya Aska Yaton Hey Alma Alahi Halashi Beit Israel. Amen. Hey, Shemei Rabba Mevorak Leolam Barak Say Darbi Talabi Talal Shemei Amin Amen. Yisrael Va'al Rabbanan Va'al Talmidei Leon, Bakol, Das, Mediva, Shayla, On, Baron, Amara, Bahina, Hayina, Rifi, Kanan, Hashim, Arabah, Shalom, Birumaz,
Beautifully done.
Okay.
So I muted everyone for just a brief moment. Oh, you figured out how to unmute. So a Yasher Koach to Rabbi Morty Schwartz, and what a beautiful sound, beautiful, noisy, but to hear 400 Jews participating in Kaddish, that's really quite something. So as you get ready to sign off, just of course, please do stay if you would like to ask questions and participate in conversation. We're so glad you're here. Please do take a moment. I posted a link and I'll put it again just now to give us your thoughts about Shavuot. And we're looking for sponsorship and participation, and we hope that you will join us for that and also give us any feedback from today. And wishing everyone a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, happy, healthy, wonderful Pesach. Thank you.
Yes, Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Remember to eat immediately, right? In other words, go and have a celebratory meal right now. As soon as you get off, if you're going to ask questions, that's fine. We're still in the process of study. That's perfectly fine. But if you're getting off, please go. Don't. You have to eat, sort of as soon as you're able at this point, in celebration of the completion of the tractate. Good. Thank you.
So please feel free to unmute and ask any questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Yasher Koach.
Yasher Koach.
Yeah. Chazak. Yeah.
Let's do this. Since we still have lots of people, if there is a question, maybe do the thing about raising hands, because there's so many screens. But Ken and Stan Ginsburg, I see you raised your hand. We'll start with you.
Can everybody but Stan mute right now so that we can make sure that where there isn't like confusion.
I'll mute everybody and then unmute Stan.
Perfect.
How's that sound? Well, maybe. Hold on, Morty. You are muted. I'll unmute you. Unmute Stan. Let's see.
Yes. Stan, if you could ask your question now, go ahead.
There we go.
You talk about 3 days before and 3 days after with the sale. Shabbos, how does Shabbos count in there?
Right. So Shabbos counts, right? The notion being that it's 3 days prior to the non-Jewish festival. Since we're counting in that, or 2 days, right? That's the dispute. Since we're counting according to the non-Jewish festival, and since there's no restriction on non-Jews going and doing business on that day, then in fact that would be part of the counting. I just want to be very clear a couple of things. One is that the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yishmael, so there's no prohibition after in the latter halachic tradition. And not only that, as I said, for Ashkenazic Jews, we don't treat Christianity as an idolatrous religion, just the opposite. So there's no prohibition on ever for us on trading with Christians. There are other religions that are idolatrous. I actually live about a mile and a half from a Hindu temple in which sort of there are idols there, and so there are questions I think that are still relevant in terms of figuring out how to relate to other religious traditions, and that those are things that we should talk about in terms of what Hinduism is today, whether or not it is an idolatrous religion. Not in this forum, but it is something that's worth talking about in consideration halachically. Great.
And I see Linda Weisner.
Linda.
Hi, I'm her husband Elliot, actually.
Great.
Relating to the idols and the images, you brought up the fact that, someone had like Buddha or various Hindu gods as artwork. Is that considered acceptable or not?
So it's a fascinating distinction that we actually find in the Mishnah and then discussed also in the Gemara here, which is that there's a notion of bitul, of nullification of idols. If a non-Jew does not believe in the idol and explicitly declares it not to be an idol, it is no longer considered to be an idol, and it's permitted for a Jew to go ahead and purchase that thing and derive any benefit they want, whether that benefit is financial or if it's aesthetic, and there's no problem. However, the notion is if a Jew purchases an idol that's an active idol, right, it can never be nullified. So it's actually important to determine the status of that piece of art or of that idol, rather which one it actually is, prior to actual purchase. In other words, if the purchaser looks at it as an ongoing idol and not as a work of art, then it's an idol and not a work of art. If the seller, I should say, the non-Jewish seller does not consider it to be an idol, instead they consider it just to be a work of art, then it's just a work of art. And that's actually the way the Gemara ends up deciding the thing. Non-Jews can always nullify idols. Jews can never nullify idols. It is up to the non-Jews to nullify the idols. Jews are kind of like stuck with whatever the non-Jewish world determines about the status of a particular item of statuary, let's say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
David Snyder?
Back in the beginning, the first Mishnah that was discussed, there was an issue of when you can collect debts from a non-Jew. I was wondering, was there ever any concern about, instead of that they be happy on their festival, that they be so angry on their festival they'd say bad things about Jews?
That's fascinating also. The notion is that their prayers to idols are ineffective. And so it's not a concern for us. If they're angry at Jews and they actually pray to the creator of heaven and earth, then that is a concern. And there is a long discussion about, at the very beginning, as I said, in the Agadic section of Avodah Zarah, of what happens when non-Jews turn to God and are more pious than Jews, which is actually a fascinating kind of discussion. So on the one hand, on the other hand, what I would say is that there is a fascinating discussion, a bit of a way into the tractate about why it is that we're concerned about non-Jews not thanking their gods. Is it because we can't participate in idolatry and therefore we can't derive benefit from it? Or is it what they say, lifnei iver lo titein michol, that we shouldn't do something that tempts non-Jews into worshiping idols, right? That they actually are prohibited from worshiping idols. And so our concern is actually leading non-Jews into sin by, sort of doing things that entice them to worship idols. And there's not a real determination that's made. There's a kind of ongoing long discussion about that question, whether we're concerned about our behavior or whether we're concerned, sort of more universally about human behavior. But it's not made clear. That's an open discussion and it's an open question, kind of like theologically.
Great. All right, I see lots of hands. We're going to go to Lindsay and then Sam and then Eva, Alba, Ella. Go for it, Lindsay. I'll remember that.
Hi. Thanks. So one of the questions that I had here was what seems to be this interesting intertwining between the rules that we seem to think of as being rules about kashrut and rules about purity that have to do with interactions with non-Jews in general. And in the last text that you taught from the Talmud, where it gives this little story and about the king cutting the citron, maybe because I'm working backwards from kind of what we know about current practice, it's sort of interesting that the king knows to stab the knife into the ground. Does he think and so I just am curious from the context of this text, and I could probably go look it up later and kind of come to my own conclusions, but is it that the knife has become impurified because of its contact with the citron, this item that's been consumed by the non-Jew, or is it that the knife itself is somehow metaphysically impure? And if it's now still being handled by this king after he stabbed it, does that seem to transmit this problematic substance to anything?
Yeah. So first of all, I just wanna say that Rabbi Healy Pollack was my student, and I'm very, very pleased to see her. She's asking questions that are just as good as the questions that she was asking as a student. Yeah, I think that your question is actually a really good one. First of all, the way the Gemara reads the Mishnah in terms of tefillah is that those first things that are used with cold items just need tefillah. It then says, well, the Gemara understands that to mean it only needs tefillah, meaning all of those things on that list that are metal or glass utensils need also to have tefillah. They also require immersion in a mikveh in order to purify them. That's the way the Gemara reads that Mishnah. So yeah, there is an ongoing discussion of purity as well as what we would call kashrut. Sort of the dietary laws. Isser v'heter is, sort of the notion. There are a couple of things that seem to be going on in the background. It's not clear why it is that Shavur Malka is able to plunge the thing in the ground to resolve the dietary issue. Wouldn't his contact with the knife, if he's really an idolater, actually render it impure due to the fact that he's an idolater? So there are two possible answers. One is that they don't consider Zoroastrianism to be an idolatrous religion, which it's not. Idols are actually not worshipped in Zoroastrianism, and probably the way we would look at it, even though they've got this very evil force that's almost tantamount in power to the creator of the universe, nonetheless, the God that they worship is a single God. It's a monolatrous religion at the very least, and so probably would not be considered idol worship. That's one possibility. The other possibility here is that there's a discussion that we find in a variety of different sources that Shapur, the emperor, Shapur II, the emperor, the Sasanian emperor, his mother apparently was Jewish. So it could be that that's actually what's going on here, that even though he considers himself a Zoroastrian, he's aware that the two other people there, the two Jews that are present with him, actually consider him to be a Jew, even though he himself thinks of himself as an emperor and a good Zoroastrian and all of those things. He's aware of that, and therefore he's aware that there's no tuma that's going to be passed on, which is another fascinating kind of notion, because then what we get here is like a Jew, right, who's an observant Jew, a rabbi. Then we get this non-observant Jew, what we would call today probably a secular Jew. And we also get a Jew whose mother is Jewish, but has been raised in another religious tradition. And those are the three people who are actually seated here in this last discussion. And Shapur, right, Shavur Malka, is actually able to know all of that, and he's able to act in a way which is going to meet the needs of all of the participants there. That's I think probably one example of what's going on here. In terms of kashrut and tuma, I'm working on a book. This hopefully is going to be my next book. My claim is that kashrut, what we call kashrut regulations, dietary laws, are ways that the rabbis are able to continue rules around tuma and animal sacrifice. And so if seems to be a blurring of the lines, that's because there's a blurring of the lines, which I think is a fascinating thing. Okay, that's my answer. Is that good, Rabbi Healy Pollack? Perfect. Okay, very good.
All right, we might not be able to get to all of these questions because we also need to make sure we all eat. But I know I said Sam was next.
Okay, the text seems to imply that all the utensils are metal, because there was some reference to heating which must be made white hot.
Yeah.
Wasn't it, there seems to be that assumption that all utensils are metal, but I know probably then and definitely now there are utensils that are not metal. I mean, I have wooden spoons in my kitchen. I know my mother has at least one ceramic knife that she's mentioned from time to time. So is this the same with the need to kosher it, make it usable in a kosher kitchen, the same? I mean, would you still need to take a ceramic knife and still stab it in the ground? Was it 10 times? Or I mean, the idea of heating a wooden spoon, you risk destroying it.
So here's what I'm gonna say. The three primary kinds of vessels that they talk about in the Mishnah and in the Talmud is, on the one hand, a kli metachet, like you say, a metal vessel, also a kli zuchuchit, a glass vessel, and then finally a kli cheres, right, a ceramic vessel. Those are the three kinds of vessels that they encounter. Glass vessels, because they don't hold heat in their period, they can simply be immersed and that's it, right? All you have to do is rinse them out, immerse them, and you're done. The vessels which are metal vessels, they have to be heated. They're the only ones that can be heated in order to remove the impurity. That's why they're only talking about metal vessels in the Mishnah, because they're the ones that can, where the flavor can be removed and can stand up to heat. And then the final kind of vessel is the kli cheres, the ceramic vessel. The notion is that it absorbs flavor so readily and holds on to its flavor that one cannot kosher it, right? The notion is shivirato, taharato. The way that it becomes pure is by breaking it, right? So there is an exception that the Gemara notes, which is that if you miyashnan, if you leave it for a year, let it grow old, that at that point, after a full year in which it's not used, the notion is that at that point, any kind of flavor that was in there is completely gone anyway, and you don't have to worry about it having let it sit for a year. There are other things that they talk about. They're not things that we really use today. They talk about wine skins that are leather coated by pitch. We don't really have those things today, but they have a notion that what you do is you basically rinse them out 3 times, letting the water sit for 24 hours, rinse it out. Let the water sit in there 24 hours, rinse it out, 24 hours, rinse it out, 24 hours, rinse it out. And then that removes, whatever wine, non-kosher wine was in there. Ashkenazim have adopted the practice for wineskins with regard to glasses, but there's no real need to, right? As I said, kli zuchuchit, all you really have to do, glass vessels, all you have to do is just kind of like rinse them out. Now, here's the thing. There are other kinds of materials that have different properties today. So for instance, Pyrex and its ilk, heat sustaining glass, is something that didn't exist in the ancient world. In fact, it didn't exist until World War I. Heat sustaining glass was originally created for aircraft. And then after World War I, it was used to create cooking vessels. And there's a dispute about whether to treat it like glass or whether to treat it like metal or whether to treat it like ceramic vessels. And there are a variety of different opinions. You can look at the RA guide about those heat sustaining glass. I think Ilana's going to put the RA Pesach guide into the links, and you can see what the recommendations are. The last thing I would say is about plastic. There seems to be a split between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews about plastic. Plastic that can sustain heat is considered to be by Sephardim and Mizrahim to be like a kli zuchuchit, like a kli metachet. It's considered to be like a metal vessel, and it can just be immersed in boiling water, and then it becomes pure. Most Ashkenazic Jews do not follow that practice. However, I believe the RA guide, if I'm not mistaken, says that one can follow the Sephardic practice, that we do follow the Sephardic practice in the conservative movement. I kosher plastic. As long as it can stand up to the heat, I don't think that that's really an issue. What's the point of all of this koshering? I think what the point of this is, because ultimately it's not really about flavor, because there's a long section in the Gemara and Avodah Zarah that says after 24 hours, we're not really worried about flavor, that all that flavor is like detrimental after 24 hours of not using it. I think what this is an initiation ritual. It's almost like converting the vessel from being a non-Jewish vessel to being a vessel in a Jewish kitchen. It's kind of an initiation ritual in the same way that conversion of human beings is an initiation ritual. And in order for it to be in a Jewish kitchen, it has to undergo this process. And the way that we undergo this process is we pretend that these flavors are actually there. You do have to wait 24 hours anyway. Whenever you're koshering these things, you can't have used the pot in the last 24 hours before actually going through the koshering process. That's as thorough an answer as I can give at the moment on Al Regel Achat. And if people have more questions about this, they can either look at the RA guide or consult their local, Mara Da'atra, their local halachic authority. Or if you really want, you can send me an email and I'll be happy to answer specific questions.
I'm going to do one last thing, which is to invite Eva, Alba, Ella, and David to each ask their question. And then hopefully, Morty, if you're able to wrap it up with one last answer, because I just hate to not let everyone have a turn.
My son is going to class. Everyone say bye to Isaac.
Bye, Isaac. Have a great day. All right. So Eva, we'll start with you.
I wondered if the rabbis addressed the iconography and statuary in Christian churches.
Okay, we'll hold that one. Alba, we're coming to you. Oh, you have to unmute. There we go.
I live in Spain. We have a synagogue here, Sinagoga La Habura. And apropos to icons in the Christian church, I wanted to tell a short 1-minute story, but I don't know if we have 1 minute.
If you could put it in the chat, I think people would be really interested. Why don't you put it in the chat and then people can benefit from it? I think that's a really good idea. Okay.
That would be
great.
But
I can tell it so much faster.
I know, but we're trying
hungry.
to wrap up.
Okay, we're going to move on to Ella. She's hungry. Okay.
Yeah, so I have a painting. Excuse me. I have a painting of a church that was painted by my Jewish friend, a recognized painter in Poland. And so how does it work with the idolatry?
Great question. And is there one more person or it's just
yes, and then David.
Go ahead.
So this was a follow-up, I think, to the first question about how we treat Christian festivals. And I'm curious, you said that the Mizrahi continue that tradition, whether they limit the festivals to Christmas, Easter, those major festivals rather than Sunday.
Okay.
And before you answer that, I just want to say that I did say to Alba, if after you answer these questions, if anyone would like to stay on to hear the story, we'd love to hear it. So hang on for that. So, all right, Morty, now you got all these questions. Go for it.
Okay, so fine. So it's iconography, paintings of sort of non-Jewish subjects by Jews, and then the question of Sunday, whether Sunday is considered by Mizrahim to be an idolatrous festival. So in terms of iconography that's discussed in the tractate, in the Mishnah, and in the Gemara, the concern is more with Roman and Hellenistic religion than it is with Christianity. Christianity seems to be discussed infrequently in the tractate. and it is discussed, but it's discussed infrequently or kind of in a less prominent way. The iconography that's addressed is, for instance, the goddess Aphrodite, Helios, the sun god, and then festivals like Saturnalia and Calendra, Cretaceous. That's the iconography and the festivals that are generally discussed, because that's sort of the major concern. We do see here, Sunday being addressed by Rabbi Yishmael. As I said, Ashkenazic Jews aren't concerned about that, but yes, Mizrahi Jews would refrain on Friday from doing business with Christians. In particular, they're concerned about things that could be used for idol worship. But yes, Friday becomes a day in the Mizrahi tradition that one is supposed not to engage in business with Christians, which is fascinating. The last piece is paintings of Christian themes by Jews. I think that's a fascinating topic altogether. Chaim Potok wrote an entire novel about a Jew who is who I believe it's called Asher Bar Lev, if I'm not mistaken, which is about a Jew who paints a crucifixion scene and all of the implications of that, which is fascinating. Chagall very famously painted a couple of different versions of what he called the crucifixion of the Jews, which was to use that classical Christian iconography to explore themes around the Shoah, around the Holocaust, and the notion being, again, the idea of God's suffering servant who is sort of vicariously atoning for the sins of the world. Whether or not you like that theology, whether or not you find that appealing, that is the way that Chagall explored it. The idea being that the Shoah is some kind of sacrifice or atonement, for the sins of the world, which is a fascinating kind of recasting of the whole notion of crucifixion. You might find that really awful, but that is what he did. And artists, you can't control what they're going to do. The last piece here, I guess I would say, is none of those things I think are prohibited, right? In other words, when the Jewish artist or the secular artist, sort of adopt a Christian theme today, they're doing that probably not for religious reasons, but for reasons of iconography. And in the Western tradition, what the crucifixion represents, more than being about atonement for sin, is an image of suffering. And one sees, the suffering Christ figure again and again and again depicted in modern art, whether that's paintings or novels or films. Let's say it this way, right? Chaim Grada and Isaac Bashevis Singer also put Christ figures in their novels, and they're about as Jewish authors as you can possibly get. Agnon also, right? They're aware of the fact that this is a Western tradition. They're influenced by Western traditions, and I think this is totally permitted. It's a way of immediately evoking suffering, which is what you want to do in a novel when you're dealing with suffering, right? Or in a painting, any work of art. Cool. Okay. I think we're going to hear a story now. Everyone's welcome to stay. Everyone's welcome to go. If you're going to go, I just want to remind you, you should eat a meal immediately. Okay, go ahead.
All right, we're going to hear a story from Alba, those who would like to stay and join us. And yes, this is being recorded, so if you'd like to keep hearing the stories, please do. So Alba, please share.
Okay, well, I did write for pretty quick the story.
Yeah.
And the thing is, here in Spain, if you want to start an eatery or any kind of business that sells food, you can't open your doors unless you have a little icon of San Pancreas, who was a Roman lawyer, and they put a piece of parsley where his hand is the pen, like the plume. And so every day they have to put a new piece of parsley in there. Okay, when the business goes under, there are plenty of companies around who removal companies that just clean the place out, everything. And you can go to their, you can go to their storehouse and buy bits and pieces of, crockery and whatever all. Okay, when you go to pay for it in this particular very famous place, where we bought all of our benches and tables from an old cider house that went under, you go in to pay it, and there are shelves and shelves and shelves of San Pancras dolls. And so I asked, so what's with the dolls? Why aren't they up for sale? And, whoa, we don't sell this stuff. This is bad luck. And we are not in the business of selling bad luck, because these businesses all went under. And so if we sell any one of these dolls, the bad luck comes back through us first. And they believe this. They really believe this. So when you made this comment that Christians are not idol worshipers, I don't know if I beg to differ or not, but you got to really believe it. And they really believe it.
Right. So what you're talking about is syncretism, which is a fascinating thing. There are pre-existing European religions that have continued, like pagan European religions that have continued sub rosa. If you're interested in this, Carlo Ginzburg wrote a whole series of books about these sub rosa religious traditions that continued among the folk populace in Europe. And, it shows all this evidence of things like the witches' Sabbath, like, sort of the continuation of idol worship through the adoration of statuettes of Christian Christian saints. And it's a fascinating topic. You're absolutely right. So this is especially true, by the way, in sort of Santeria, which is a kind of, sort of Latin American folk religion that actually treats Catholic saints as stand-ins for pre-existing pagan gods that were part of the native religions in South America and Latin America originally. And the question is, even if the elite religion of Christianity is in fact monotheistic, you have to question when you have folk practices that appear to be idolatrous. Are they idolatrous or are they not? And do they have festivals that are somehow separate from Christian festivals? Can you actually, like Palgina and Dibura, like separate them into like two different kinds of groups and say, well, Christianity isn't idolatrous, but in fact this other folk practice might be, and who are the people who are involved in that folk practice? So again, I recommend all of Carlo Ginzburg's books. They're fascinating. A great scholar of European religious history, the history of the rise of secularism, and replete with magical battles and witches and wizards and druids and all sorts of really interesting topics worth looking at. Okay.
Awesome. Yasher Koach, Morty. Thank you everyone for being here, and we hope that we will see you soon. Wishing everyone a Chag Sameach once again. Thank you.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Hazis in Pesach. Hazis in Pesach.
Hazis in Pesach. Bye everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
To you.
Oh, look at that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Cool.